And we are back. It's the Disruptive Diner. It is still May 20th, 2014. If you are just tuning in, we are having the discussion Foreshadowed by Fiction. We're exploring what we can learn about our future by exploring fiction. And if you're like us, you were having a phenomenal conversation during the break where we were really exploring, if I could paraphrase for you guys, what happens when we create when we create more leisure time, and how does that get filled, and how does that economically work, But before we get back to that discussion, we have a second presenter, and Michael White is here, and Michael does genetics research at Washington University here in St. Louis. I'm sorry, I just realized I hadn't gotten your presentation ready. And does some work in how genes express themselves and how that works. And for the non-biotech folks among us, which I know just enough to really be dangerous, although I don't do anything in a fume hood, so I don't really do anything dangerous. But so that's looking at there was a thought that once we understood the human genome, that was going to be like the blueprint. We were going to know everything, and it turns out that's not the case. It's way more complex than that. And that's the space that he's in. But what he's going to do is talk a little bit about what he's seen in biotech, in science fiction and in speculative fiction, and what that looks like and where that's kind of hit the mark, and I think some places where it hasn't. And then some interesting things that we can explore, use as a leaping off ground to kind of explore what are things like, the zombie apocalypse or global warming or all of these other things. We have this big existential fear going on that's kind of permeating our culture now, and kind of what is that letting us explore a little bit by the fiction, correct?
Yeah.
You're going to answer the question, right? You're going to say what we should
No zombies this time, I'm sorry, but most of those.
Are you going to give us an investment strategy so we know how to prep and how many bitcoins to put in our cellars and everything?
If you can figure that out for my talk, please let me know.
When Michael finishes, remember he's doing the Pachacha format, 20 slides, 20 seconds each, so cut him some slack. We're going to have a great discussion afterwards, as evidenced by the great discussion we were having when we were offline. And if you have any questions, comments, things you'd like to add to the discussion, make sure you text them or tweet them to me or email them to me. And would you like to say anything else before I get you started? Take a breath.
Cut me some slack, right.
Cut you some slack. I'm going to get you,
there we go.
I'm going to get your
Should
water for you in case you need that.
Ah, great. All right.
And when we come back, we'll have some questions. But right now, I give you Michael White. You are ready to go.
All right. There we go. Well, I want to start out by saying I don't think biotechnology has been foreshadowed by science fiction very well, at least until recently. At least, what we call hard science fiction, that kind of technically realistic imagination of future technology has been slow to develop when it comes to biology. So a great example of this is thinking about space travel versus how biology looks. Edgar Allan Poe wrote a story about a trip to the moon in a hot air balloon in 1835, and he had a lot of realistic details about ballooning, but the premise was absurd. In 1949, science fiction authors were foreshadowing moon travel much more realistically, and so I would argue we are currently a little more like Poe. So as an example, one of the greatest geneticists of the 20th century, J.B.S. Haldane, had a science fiction speculation, but he made the claim that we really don't know much about biology right now, but we shouldn't be too modest in our speculations. So he went ahead and speculated from kind of a base of ignorance in this essay called Daedalus. Published in 1924, it was written in the form of a history of eugenics written by some future student in 2073. Haldane called them a few obvious developments, but in fact, I think they were rather lazy speculations about human reproduction turned over to a eugenic program in 1990. Although he did make a pretty prescient observation, I think, is that biological inventions are often viewed as perversions, and Aldous Huxley proved him right. He took Haldane's vision and wrote it up as a dystopia in Brave New World, where where humans live in this genetically engineered society. And although Haldane got a few things right, we can genetically screen embryos for a few traits these days, I think overall there are grim prospects for a rationally designed human breeding program right now. So a recent paper shows that if you wanted to breed tall humans, you're better off using Victorian statistics than modern genomics at this point. However, I've been talking about technical plausibility, but that's really not the only possibility for foreshadowing. I think there's another important way that science fiction foreshadows future technology, and that is sort of the ethos or our attitudes towards that technology. And a great example is William Gibson's seminal 1984 cyberpunk novel, Neuromancer. So in this novel, Gibson imagines cyberspace and multinational corporations and hackers battling out over access to information. But in fact, Gibson didn't know much about computers or networks when he wrote it. People complained it's not realistic, you'll never have enough bandwidth. And Gibson said, well, I scarcely knew what bandwidth was. So if you look at his vision of what cyberspace was supposed to look like, kind of a virtual reality type thing, it's very different from our much more prosaic text-based internet today. Internet hacking. However, the ethos of cyberpunk strongly influenced the countercultural attitudes towards the internet. So what about 21st century biology? Are we getting a better hard biological science fiction that really is carefully thinking about future technical challenges? And then what about the ethos? Are we seeing kind of the cyberpunk countercultural ethos applied to biology? So a great book that does both is Wind Up Girl by Paolo Bacigalupi, who envisions this post-fossil fuel, globally warmed world where calories are incredibly scarce. Calories take the form of genetically modified crops that are owned by multinational corporations and governments. And there's gene hacking and gene theft. And so it's a really compelling world. The author said he came up with this world because he's very interested in agricultural corporations and the idea that they might own the genetics of our food supply. And so given that Wind Up Girl looks like our world might look in some ways a few decades down the road, that is a very compelling question. The author said, we didn't necessarily have to wait till this moment in time to start asking these questions. It's been a while. Science fiction authors need to bring offstage questions on stage, questions about where does our food come from? Where does the energy come from? Where are the building block materials? So in Bacigalupi's world, calories are scarce. How are we doing today? Do we look anything like that? So far, our calorie budget is keeping pace. We don't do very well distributing it. And this is thanks to continual agricultural innovation, but how long can we keep that going? So a few weeks ago, I wrote an article about the fact that we just need to keep running just to stay in place. And the question of how climate change will affect our ability to innovate agriculturally is still a very open one. So the world of Wind Up Girl is certainly, parts of it are very well within our future. And so if that future starts to happen, what if genetically modified genetic engineering plays a larger role in our food supply? Well, actually, these are already questions we're facing. Who owns the genetics for genetically modified organisms? And so in this case, I think biology has actually foreshadowed science fiction in a sense. John Clute has kind of picked up on this theme, the author of the Encyclopedia for Science Fiction, who says, writers of speculative fiction have always been interested in biology, but only in the last few decades have they really begun seriously thinking about biotechnology. On the other hand, as I mentioned, technical plausibility really is not the only way that science fiction foreshadows biotechnology. So what about the ethos? What about our attitudes towards corporations owning all the genetics? Well, there's an emerging subgenre of science fiction called biopunk, taking kind of the countercultural cyberpunk ethos and applying it to biology. And we even have some real-life biopunk going on. So Canadian futurist Andrew Hessel asked the idea, what if we could hack cancer? What if people working in their garages could hack cancer and give away the cures for free? It's a nice vision. Unfortunately, I think at this point it's completely unrealistic and implausible, but the ethos is there. The attitude we should have towards technology is there. And maybe here's a place where our attitude, our ethos can merge with technical realism. Who's going to own the genetics if GMOs play a big part of our future? Well, why not make the genes open source? So I think there's a lot here, both for biotechnologists and for science fiction authors to think about.
All right, thank you.
Thanks.
As you were talking, it suddenly occurred to me, these very, big ideas and the ideas of, our relationship with, other things that we were talking about with Mark. it reminded me, that there's this, realization that, mitochondria, essentially what powers our cells might have actually been a separate species and a whole other organism that was actually absorbed into human. We might actually be the sum of more than two species to begin with. So that these are all, we shouldn't necessarily think that these are horrible things. I mean, they may make life possible, but they're just kind of an interesting to see.
So our microbiome, we have.
Our microbiome, where the DNA of all of the microbiota or the microorganisms walking around with Dan exceed the amount of DNA of Dan. Once again, if you've got questions or comments or whatever thing, text them in. But tell me a little bit about, when you talked about like Wind Up Girl, what's something that's really interesting about what's a hack, or how have they dealt with something like climate change? So like if we could take this, this very horrible world, there's all kinds of bad things that happen, but what's something hopeful out of it that you could kind of see from that? It's like, oh, well, that's maybe one way that we could cope with something.
Well, I mean, the hopeful thing in Wind Up Girl is that to some degree humanity managed to adapt, right? So there's the technical know-how to keep the food supply going, but now we still have the problem of distribution, which we haven't solved now, and in Wind Up Girl they haven't solved then. So there's some optimism in the book that we will have the technological know-how to continue to produce what we need in order to keep civilization going, but will we have the right attitude towards technology? Will we have the commitment to build the institutions we need to do that?
So would you say, you talked about, the criticism of William Gibson and Neuromancer, which was, there's not enough bandwidth to actually make this possible. And he didn't even know what bandwidth was. Or barely knew what it was. I think he probably knew.
Right. He knows a lot more now, right? Yeah.
Well, he probably knew a little bit about it. He just wouldn't have put it in words. But,
right. He's
when you think about it in the biotech world, what is, when you think of, is it ribopunk? Is that what you call it?
Ribopunk was the name of an anthology, but yeah, biopunk. In
biopunk, right? What is the arguing thing that people are like, oh, this would never really happen because here's this limiting factor. So what is this limiting factor that we see now that might disappear as quick as the limiting factor of bandwidth disappeared over 20 years?
Well, it's biological complexity, right? So one reason biology seems to be so hard to engineer is we just can't, you change a little something and you have all these unforeseen consequences.
Right.
So the question is, and this is something that could disappear quickly, we may find ways of dealing with this complexity where we don't have to take all of it into account. We learn what kinds of tweaks we make. So for example, there's a movement among biological engineers right now to create microbes that are sort of a chassis for, like the chassis of a car, and then you can put different engines in it or whatever. You have a chassis there that can take different biological modules and...
So you can have the soccer mom organism, or you can have...
you can have whatever, yeah.
Sports car one. Isn't it true also that like in your world, like this idea of complexity, that maybe we're going to get to a new mental model of understanding it that makes it, right now it's just a lot of details.
Yeah.
But wasn't it, that there was some thought originally that there were like 80,000 genes, that the humans had 80,000 or 100,000 or whatever
genes.
Right,
a lot more.
And it turns out that we actually have way fewer genes, that, that there are things that are changing as far as the complexity that we understand.
Well, it goes down in one sense. We have fewer of these traditionally viewed canonical genes that encode proteins, but it turns out maybe there's a lot more DNA around that regulates those genes. Maybe just as much DNA regulating the genes as genes themselves. So complexity goes down, it goes back up. It's still a big issue.
So who here in the room, or who here online, or who that's watching our live stream and everything, what have you seen in the case of biotech? What is something that you're kind of interested in where that gets us? When I read Wind Up Girl, and I was really struck by it, one of the things that I was really struck by is there's part of the book where people keep talking about this elusive fruit that nobody has seen, and it's kind of like this holy grail that if we find that, there's people that think that that's going to make them wealthier, and they don't know what it's called because they're in a future where they've forgotten what that is. But I happen to have been in Thailand, and I actually had that fruit. So I'm spending the entire book like, they're talking about rambutan. They're talking about rambutan. Here's what it tastes like. So to me, that's kind of an interesting connection. But what are some things that you guys see when you see biotech or biopunk, or when you hear about stuff in this space? And even if you just say, what was your reaction to Frankenstein? Was it like, can you really do that? Was it, what was your reaction to it?
Hi, thank you for the presentation. I guess my question is, and I'll foreshadow it by the fact that I'm a scientist by training, what is the difference in your mind between a scientific hypothesis and science fiction? So if you'd like to address that, and maybe the recent news of the group out of Scripps that actually found 2 new bases, or created 2 new bases.
Yep. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. I think science fiction can pose hypotheses in the sort of the more traditional meaning of the world. A hypothesis has to be something you can go out and test. And in order to test it, you have to have the wherewithal to do that. So maybe the experimental technology, the analysis tools to actually test it. But I think science fiction certainly has a role of posing hypotheses, especially when it comes to how maybe economic or social hypotheses about how a technology will play out. So you brought up, this recent genetic engineering feat that's been in the news, where they added 2 extra DNA bases to this organism. And to me, that represents all of the challenges faced by biological engineering right now. So that project, it was expensive, it was difficult, it was time consuming. And at this point, the practical applications for that are almost nothing. It's kind of a demonstration piece. I mean, pretty impressive.
It's kind of like the old 50s thing about just as easily as there could be carbon-based life form, there could be silicon-based life form. And maybe that's what, okay.
And we'll just come out, right, yeah.
So now what? Yeah.
So people are working hard on it. So I think, as we think ahead, I think it's important not underestimate the challenge that we can face getting to, say, the world that Bacigalupi describes, even if it's a non-dystopian version. But we can still, at the same time, start thinking about these compelling questions about, once we get there, how are they going to play out? Who's going to own the genetics of our food supply?
One of the things I think that was really powerful, and we're going to wrap up because people that are watching the live stream especially need to get back to, maybe back to their conference calls that they're halfway listening to. But I just want to ask, one of the interesting things I heard as I prepared for this, and you guys both did a phenomenal job, but I want to ask both of you the same question. One of our presenters said, one of the people that we interviewed for background information on this said, when you look at it, fiction gives you the chance to really do inductive thinking. So I can explore a lot of things all at once. But if I really want to get down and prove something, I have to do a reductionist approach to it. So I can imagine a whole new world with all of the implications and all of these, and how everything interrelates to each other. But then that gives me something to test against, to do a hypothesis against. So so he said it's freeing because it allows you to look at everything. Whereas if you were to just take a hypothesis, you can't necessarily see where that takes you very far. Mm-hmm. So, so I would just ask each of you to give me just a minute or two on what you think of as the relationship between, if we think about it as not as an either or, but how do they coexist to explore things, speculatively, and then how to make them either come to reality or, holy cow, let's not go down that path. That goes someplace bad. Mm-hmm. Just give me your thoughts, and I'm going to hand the mic to you first, Mark.
The function of hypothesis in science fiction?
Well, how do you think that it works between speculation and actually turning that something into something,
Well, the speculation is inspirational. We all know the story of all of the rocket engineers that decided to go into that because they read Heinlein when they were growing up. Partial answer to your question about what's the difference between science fiction and hypothesis. Hypothesis, as you said, is something that can be tested. Science fiction presumes that's already happened. And now we're looking at the effects on civilization, on communities, on people. And is this a desirable thing? It's an awful lot of dystopian science fiction because obviously the conclusion is no, we don't really want to do that. And that, I think, is the function of the fiction, is to let's play with these ideas and let's not forget that people are involved, which often gets overlooked when you're just in the lab crunching numbers or whatever. Oh, look what I just invented. Oh my God.
Yeah, for example, like you said, coming up with 2 new base pairs, that's really interesting. Now, one thing is that nature at any point could have come up with 2 new base pairs. It's not like they artificially created elements and, whatever.
Yeah.
just nature has not ever seen need for 2 new base pairs, or if they were, they weren't useful, you know.
Yeah, they've been long since discarded, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So, but how could you explore that? You know, so think about, you know, maybe use that as a specific example. So, you know, so you can do that, but how would that, what would the interrelation of exploring what that impact is work with speculative fiction?
Yeah. Well, actually, I would go back, to answer this, I would go back to Haldane, who I quoted earlier. And I knocked him a little bit for speculations, but actually I think he had some things right. So he chastised biologists for being, first of all, overconfident about their present knowledge, but also for being too modest in their speculations there. So I think you really do need to free yourself a little bit from being so close to the present knowledge and start thinking about the other possibilities. So this particular team that came up with 2 new bases, they can envision some practical applications. I don't think anything's really going to happen in the immediate future, but just giving it a try and opening up the possibilities and sort of developing the technology is important in science. Thinking.
So who do you think might write something really interesting or do something interesting with that premise? You know, so what happens? You know, 20 years from now,
with two
who's
bases,
who's the John Galt of the 2 extra base pairs or whatever? You know?
John Galt, yeah, or else it enables us surviving and taking over.
Yeah. So do you see anybody that would really be somebody that we ought to look at to say, oh, that person's really exploring some interesting territory?
I don't know. I mean, my science fiction tastes often run towards the dystopians. I can imagine he's no longer with us. I can imagine Michael Crichton writing about these new organisms, you know, taking over the Earth there.
Well, great. Well, we need to wrap up because it is 1 o'clock. Thank you very much for joining us for the Disruptive Diner. Thank you once again to Michael and Mark, who did a fantastic job with this topic. So it is May 20th. These will be posted to YouTube. You'll be able to watch their videos. You'll be able to see their presentations and download them from SlideShare. Thank you once again. Also, we'll be posted a discussion guide with some really good leading questions to think about how can you use this to just think about how you solve your own problems. You know, where can you find your own inspiration and where are we maybe stuck by our mental models? And I'll close with one last thing just to kind of illustrate why this is important. There's a great ad that I've not actually been able to find a copy of, but you know, it used to be that desks were roll-top desks with all these pigeonholes, and in the early 1900s, somebody came up with the idea of a filing cabinet with these drawers with these things that they called folders that you could put things in, and that if every piece of paper was exactly the same size, they could fit in there, and then you could create these taxonomies, they called them, that you could organize all of this information. And this was so transformative to business that it was suggested that if you owned a business of at least 100 employees, that you should spend 6 months learning how to use a filing cabinet because it would transform your business. But it should not be delegated to clerks or certainly women, because at that time, women, that was just, they didn't know anything. But the idea of a mental model that we can organize our thinking by and everything is really powerful, and that's I think what science fiction allows us to do, is build new mental models for how we collaborate, how we exchange information, and how we move forward. So something that we're reading about today will be the filing cabinet of the future, whether that's in 20 years or 50 years or 100 years. It's going to happen because the groundwork gets laid someplace. But thank you very much for Michael and Mark, and we'll see you next month.